Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I will start uploading some videos. Before I start about this video on the topic of anatomy and physiology, I would like to say that to reply to a very common question that no, my videos do not cover all the topics. Here you can see a QR code that if you scan it, this QR code here, and if you scan it, you can see my contact information, including my number on WhatsApp, as well as my Gmail. So, whatever you need, questions, you can email me. I admit that I have not been checking my emails lately, but I plan to change that. Also, I would like to say that I'm offering private tutoring sessions, either on specific topics, either some as an advisor to check on your preparation and to help you understand some topics that are a little bit harder to grasp, or full on the course. For more information, you can just contact me by scanning this QR code.
Homeostasis is the concept that certain parameters of the human body need to remain stable and within a small range. For example, blood pressure, blood pH, and hormone levels. The main organs responsible for maintaining homeostasis are in the brainstem and the endocrine glands. As we're going to see in more detail, the master of most endocrine glands is the hypothalamus. So hypothalamus is usually perceived as the master organ for homeostasis.
So, in a system, in order to achieve homeostasis, the first thing that happens is there is an imbalance. So, there is this stimulus that causes an imbalance for whichever reason. And now we need to turn through some specific steps back to our normal variety. First, our body needs to sense that imbalance. So, there needs to be a receptor organ that will recognize it. Then a control center needs to integrate the information from different receptors and in turn send information to effector cells that are the body system that is going to restore this imbalance that caused in the beginning. We can see a very simple example just to understand homeostasis about blood pressure. So blood pressure should be, let's say, 120/80. First, there is a blood pressure increase for whichever reason. Then we said that the next step was the sensor organs, the receptors. The receptors will sense the increase in the blood pressure, and this information will be integrated in a control center. In that case, it would be the brainstem. And then they're gonna send signals to the effector organ, which is gonna be the area that is gonna be responsible to lower again our blood pressure. And then the blood pressure will be back to the baseline and homeostasis will be restored. The endocrine system is just one system of many that are responsible for homeostasis. And endocrine refers to how signaling is done. For example, if the chemical messenger is secreted by a cell and it acts on the same cell, this is called autocrine. If it goes to nearby cells, then it is paracrine. Endocrine secretion is when the effector, the chemical messengers, the signaling molecules travel through the bloodstream to reach remote tissues in the body. The distance doesn't matter. The point is that they secrete directly into the blood. So there is diffusion all over the body of these chemical messengers. Of course, we can understand that the quantity that these cells will release will be much better than the quantity released in a paracrine or an autocrine manner. And then synaptic secretion is something special for the nervous system, in which the nerve cell releases the chemical messengers, which are directly perceived by the target cell, and they are in very close proximity to each other. Another way of signaling is juxtacrine signaling, which in human cells happens through gap junctions. And in this case, the two cells are in direct contact with each other. So, for example, in paracrine manner, the two cells are very close to each other, but not in direct contact. So the signaling cell secretes the chemical messengers in the interstitial tissue, and then the target cell receives them and receives the information. However, in the juxtacrine manner of chemical signaling, we can see that the molecules pass from one cell to the other directly through direct contact. So the main difference is at this point. Direct cell contact, yes, in the juxtacrine manner. Again, talking about endocrine signaling, let's see some main properties. The first one is that the source is usually a gland. What does that mean? A gland is a collection of epithelial cells. It can be exocrine or endocrine. The exocrines release their products through a duct into the lamen of an organ. For example, we have the pancreas releasing its secretions in the duodenum, the small intestine. In this case, this is an exocrine manner. While the pancreas also has endocrine function, where specific cells in the pancreas release the hormones into the bloodstream. After they release it to the bloodstream, these chemical messengers, in the case of the endocrine system, they're called hormones, they can arrive to any tissue. And usually they have two types of effects. The first one is metabolism. So they can go to non-target organs and regulate and modulate their metabolism. While in the target cells, why is it target cell? Because this cell will have a receptor specific for that hormone. We're gonna talk about it. And they are gonna induce a very, very specific effect. In a paracrine manner, as we said, the distribution doesn't happen through the blood, but instead it happens in the matrix, in the extracellular matrix. And the target cell is in close proximity. This slide reflects upon the main differences between the endocrine and the nervous system. The main difference is the distance of the signaling. So for example, in the endocrine and the target cells can be very far away. For example, we can secrete something from our brain in an endocrine manner, travel to the bloodstream and arrive all the way to the adrenal glands, for example, which are in the abdomen. But in the nervous system, the signaling cell that will release the chemical messenger, in that case called a neurotransmitter, to the target cells, is always in very, very, very close proximity. The distance here is nanometers, even micrometers. So, what implications does that have? That means, first of all, that this in the nervous system, it's a means of communication that is very, very fast. So we can see that it is within 1 to 10 milliseconds in order for the transmission to happen. While in the endocrine system, the response will be slower because of the time that it takes for the hormones to arrive from the signaling cell all the way to the target cell. However, that can mean that this will also have a much more long-lasting effect because we don't have a way of breaking them down. So whenever their half-life tells them to die, basically, which is when they will dissolve, only then the signal will stop having its effect. While in the nervous system, there is an active method of breaking down the neurotransmitter. So when the stimulus stops, the the signaling also stops. And another major component is that the effect, as it says here, it will be very local because we need this direct contact. While in the endocrine system, we can have very widespread effects throughout the body. That doesn't mean that one system is better than the other, but it just means that each system is suited for a different function. Here again, a slide that depicts the major differences. Here we see that the distance can be very big and that there are two important steps. The hormones released by endocrine systems need to get into the bloodstream and then exit from the bloodstream, which will be happening to all the tissues. So we can understand that the quantity released is very, very big, very large. While here the distance is so small, the quantity released is much smaller. The main endocrine organs in our body are the hypothalamus and the pituitary, located in the brain, together with the pineal gland. Then in the neck we have the thyroid and the parathyroid. And in the abdomen we have the adrenals, which lie on top of the kidney, and the pancreas. Also, the male and female reproductive organs, the testes and the ovaries more specifically, are endocrine organs. What is an endocrine organ? An endocrine organ is an organ whose main responsibility is an endocrine function. That doesn't mean that these are the only organs in the body that have endocrine function, but for these organs, their main function is endocrine. Okay, now let's see another important concept in the endocrine system is that there are axes. That means there are specific layovers of the signaling pathway, and each organ has a responsibility. Now, for example, a stimulus will be recognized by the hypothalamus, which in turn will dictate the pituitary to release a hormone that is going to have an effect on a gland. Then the gland is going to release another hormone, which is going to have an effect on a target cell. So these three layovers, hypothalamus, pituitary, and the gland, will release hormones, all of them. However, the function of the hypothalamus and the pituitary are not to release the hormone in order to get an effect. They are to release the hormone in order another gland to release a hormone to have an effect. And this is what an axis is. Here we can see some basic principles of signaling and signal transduction, which is important to understand as to how there's going to be effect of the hormone. You should know the major signal transduction pathways for the IMAT, and I do not think I covered them in any of the videos I've made. Maybe I will make one in the future. However, the principles of signaling is that an extracellular signal will be converted into an action inside the cell. For example, the hormone is going to bind to a receptor, and then through a series of events inside the cell, a response the effect is gonna take place. The same way it happens with the phone. The phone receives some radio signal and as a result produces sound. Talking about receptors a bit, we have two types of receptors. One are cell surface receptors and the other ones are intracellular receptors. The different receptors can bind different hormones, and what dictates whether a hormone will bind to an extracellular receptor, a plasma membrane receptor, or an intracellular receptor is the properties of the hormone. So the hormone needs to be small and hydrophobic in order to be able to cross the plasma membrane, while if it is big and hydrophilic, then it will require a cell surface receptor in order to perform its function. Here we can see another property about the axis that we were talking earlier. So we saw the hypothalamus will release some hormones that are going to have an effect to the pituitary gland, which is gonna have an effect on a target gland to secrete the ultimate hormone and to get the response from the target organs. However, what is important to understand for the regulation of these signaling pathways, of this axis, is that there are feedback loops. So, what does that mean? The hypothalamus will start telling to the hypophysis, the pituitary, through releasing hormones. So it's going to start releasing hormones, as they're called, and in turn, the pituitary will secrete the pituitary hormones, and then the target gland is going to secrete the ultimate hormone. And this is going to keep on happening. When the levels of the ultimate hormone are increased, they're also going to bind to a cell, to the cells that were secreting the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And they're going to inhibit that cell from secreting any more hormone. So this is a mechanism by which we put the brakes. So every time you're studying a system in biology in general, you shouldn't only know how it starts, but also how it stops, because many diseases are caused by a dysregulation of these pathways, and the brakes of the pathway do not work. So it's important to know that when the ultimate hormone will be increased in levels, we expect the hormone secreted by both the pituitary and the hypothalamus to be in low levels. And we're going to see an example about that. So, talking about extracellular receptors, this is just this is a picture to depict a concept. Of course, you don't need to know all the specific steps. However, what is the concept? That when something binds, for instance, we see here the estrogen receptor, and here we see estrogen binding to a receptor in the membrane, so an extracellular receptor, because it is hydrophilic in nature, the estrogen. There is going to be a series of events activated inside the cell. That they might change the transcriptional profile of the cell. They might also induce changes inside the cell. For example, here we see that this pathway induces the release of calcium from the endoplasmic reticulum, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. So signal transduction within the cell is a very complicated and complex process. And it is important to understand that one hormone in one cell might have many actions. Also, one hormone might have different actions in different cells. For example, we might consider a hormone a cell that has only this receptor, and in turn, we're going to have the transcriptional change. But another cell might have only this receptor, for example, and the effect of that hormone would be the release of calcium from the endoplasmic reticulum. Same hormone, different target cells, different effects. Why different effects? Because the different target cells have different receptors. So the effect that a hormone will have is mediated by the receptor, not by the hormone itself. All the hormone does is to bind to the receptor. The receptor is the one that is going to dictate what sort of effect this hormone will have. And that is a very important concept to know. Talking about the pituitary, we can see that it is located inside the brain, inside the neurocranium, as it's called. So the skull, the cranium, has two parts, the neurocranium and the splachnocranium. So it is located inside the neurocranium in this indentation called sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. There is a typo here. And the pituitary has two lobes, if we want to say, an anterior and a posterior. The pituitary gland is also called hypophysis. The anterior pituitary is called also adenohypophysis, and the posterior pituitary is called neurohypophysis. We're going to understand why in just a second. Before though, let's see that the hypothalamus lies directly superior, that means above, to the pituitary, and it is important because we saw earlier in the axis that there was the hypothalamus will send a signal in the pituitary. So the distance that this signal needs to cover will be very small. So when the hypothalamus secretes something, it will only get to the anterior pituitary. So let's say this is the releasing hormone. That's how we said They will call the ones released from the hypothalamus, and it will only need to travel that distance in order to produce an effect. What is its effect? The release of another hormone, a different one, by the anterior pituitary. This is the system on how the anterior pituitary works. The posterior pituitary is a sort of modified nervous tissue. Think of it in a very simple way. So remember how we were saying that we have nervous cells. We have nervous cells that release the neurotransmitter, and its effect is on the cell next to them. There is a synapsis between the neuron and the other neuron, and the neurotransmitter is released there in the synaptic cleft to have all these properties that we discussed earlier. However, the posterior pituitary receives the axon terminals from two areas in the hypothalamus. And what do? They secrete the neurotransmitter, but in the blood. And the molecules that secrete, they're hormones. By definition, if you secrete a substance in the blood with a chemical messenger property and its targets are distant, in turn, the definition is endocrine secretion and hormones. However, we can see that these are nervous cells that do this endocrine function simply by releasing the neurotransmitter to the blood. Now, these hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, also called arginine vasopressin. The effects of these two hormones are very important. Oxytocin is released during labor in order to induce the uterus to contract. So its target cells are muscle cells in the uterus of the female. And also to contract the myoepithelial cells in the ducts of the lactating in order to push the milk out. Be careful, mind my words. To push the milk out. Oxytocin will not cause the mammary glands to produce milk. It will cause the mammary glands to release the milk that has already been produced because its effector is a myoepithelial cell. It's a muscle cell, a modified muscle cell. Antidiuretic hormone and arginine vasopressin is the same hormone with two names. Two names, two functions. If you know these two names, then you know their functions. Arginine vasopressin is called like that because it induces vasoconstriction. So vasopressin, pressure increases in the arterioles because they constrict. So when volume gets low, pressure goes up, and it's called vasopressin because of that function. It's also called antidiuretic hormone. Why? Because it increases the water permeability at the level of the collecting tube in the nephron in the kidney. By increasing the water permeability, we reabsorb, so we maintain more water, so we urinate less. So it's called antidiuretic hormone. It has an antidiuretic effect. Now, the anterior hypophysis, or pituitary, also called adenohypophysis, secretes a number of hormones. But remember, in order to secrete any of those hormones, it needs to receive a signal from the hypothalamus in the form of a releasing hormone. So, for example, one of the hormones it secretes is the thyroid stimulating hormone. The thyroid stimulating hormone acts on the thyroid, and the thyroid in turn will release thyroid hormones. So the pituitary secretes thyroid stimulating hormone and the thyroid when the thyroid stimulating hormone arrives there will release thyroid hormones. Then we also have thyrotropin releasing hormone, or just called thyrotropin, which will be secreted from the hypothalamus. It will arrive to the anterior pituitary. In turn, the anterior pituitary will secrete TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, and that will arrive to the thyroid and will secrete thyroid hormone. And this was the concept of the axis that we talked earlier about. So the hypothalamus is the master of the axis, and the anterior pituitary is right below it. These are the main hormones, and this is a table. We're going to go into more details for everything except FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, as well as LH, luteinizing hormone, which will be dealt which are dealt usually in the topics of reproductive anatomy and physiology. So we can just mention a thing or two. The luteinizing hormone is responsible to stimulate the ovaries and the testes, while the follicle stimulating hormone, it stimulates the gonads to produce sperm and ovum. The regulation of the two and their function is complicated, so we're gonna see them later on. However, it's important to know that these hormones will induce the production of estrogen and progesterone from the ovaries, while testosterone will be produced from the testes. Again, this will be dealt in the reproductive topics. I'm just briefly mentioning. For the rest, you can take a picture of the tables since it summarized very, very briefly, and now we're going to go into more details. Starting with the adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. Of course, released under the hypothalamus first, releases a releasing hormone, and which acts on the level of the anterior pituitary to secrete ACTH. Now let's see what it does. First, let's talk about the adrenal gland. And the adrenal gland has two parts, a cortex and a medulla. The cortex has three layers, and the medulla is, I would say, a modified sympathetic ganglion. We're gonna see it. So the cortex, as I said, has three layers. Of course, you don't need to know their names. However, it is important to know that the cortex is responsible for releasing cortisol, aldosterone, and some androgens in the specific layers, as I said. Cortisol is released by the adrenal cortex in response to ACTH. So ACTH will only act in the first layer of the adrenal cortex. I'm sorry, in the middle layer of the adrenal cortex in order to release cortisol. The first layer, which is going to be the one to secrete aldosterone, is going to be under the effect of angiotensin 2, which has been dealt in the urinary system. The angiotensin 2, the renin system, so on, so on. The renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, as it's called, RAS. Now, back to cortisol. What is the pattern of secretion for the cortisol? What steps need to be made? First, corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus goes to the anterior pituitary. In the anterior pituitary, specific cells have a receptor for CRH. As a response, CRH induces the release of ACTH, adrenocorticotropin hormone, and this arrives to the adrenal cortex, and in turn, the adrenal cortex releases cortisol. The effect of cortisol is rather widespread, and here you can see again the axis from the hypothalamus to the pituitary to the adrenal gland to the adrenal cortex more specifically to release cortisol, and we can see that it has a many targets. Increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased blood glucose. Cortisol is also secreted more in the morning, and it also has an effect in blocking, let's say very simply, the immune system. So whenever you're taking a cortisone, cortisone is a drug, it's an analog of cortisol. Whenever you're taking cortisones, their effect is to inhibit the immune system. Again, briefly mentioning aldosterone, which is part of the urinary system, as we said, because it is released in response to angiotensin 2, again from the adrenal cortex, however, and there is a whole system for that, and the effects can be seen here. However, I'm not going to go into detail in this video since I'm staying focused on the endocrine system, on the endocrine organs, the organs that have as a primary function an endocrine function. Now we can see another hormone, growth hormone. Growth hormone is released by the anterior pituitary in response to GHRH, which is released from the hypothalamus. Growth hormone acts at the level of the liver, and the liver in turn secretes IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1. And what does it do? It causes the growth of the epiphyseal plates, as we can see here. And so it causes growth of the human body. It has, again, many effects, and one important effect is excess of growth hormone. For example, due to a tumor in the pituitary that produces growth hormone, can cause gigantism in children and acromegaly in adults. Then we can see prolactin. Prolactin doesn't really go through an axis, so it is secreted again by the anterior pituitary, and it goes directly to the target organ, which is the mammary glands in the breast. And what does prolactin cause? Prolactin causes the production of milk. So the anterior pituitary releases prolactin that will induce the mammary gland to make milk, while and also during pregnancy to enlarge the mammary gland and make it a more ready network for the production of large quantities of milk. And also the posterior pituitary, as we saw before, will release oxytocin, which will be responsible for pushing that milk out. And then again about follicle stimulating hormone and LH, luteinizing hormone, they will be dealt in more detail in the reproductive system. A part that there's a part in the pituitary, so this is the anterior pituitary, this is the posterior pituitary, this is the stalk that will connect it to the hypothalamus, and there is a pars intermedia, which is something in between, let's say, which secretes melanocyte stimulating hormone, which causes the melanocytes in the skin of some vertebrates, to produce melanin. However, I do not think you should know that. I just mentioned it in case. Now, let's visit some of the most important glands in the body: the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenal gland, and the pancreas, the adrenal medulla, and the pancreas. First, the thyroid gland releases two types of hormones. One are the thyroid hormones, and the other one is calcitonin. Let's take a look through the system. We have thyrotropin releasing hormone by the hypothalamus to the pituitary. The pituitary secretes TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, and the thyroid gland releases T3, and T4. So the thyroid gland, as we said before, releases thyroid hormones as well as calcitonin. However, calcitonin, we're going to see it in a few slides, the stimulus for the release of calcitonin is not thyroid stimulating hormone. Instead, thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to release only T3 and T4, the thyroid hormones, whose function is growth and development. They have a synergistic effect with catecholamines, so they help them do their action more actively, and also increase metabolism in the body. Again, I would like to stress out that increased level of the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, will have a negative effect both on the hypothalamus and on the anterior pituitary to stop releasing TRH and TSH. What does that mean? If I take blood from my patient and I see that T3 and T4 are elevated, then I expect TRH and TSH to be reduced. As simple as that. If not, there is something wrong with the system. Then we can see again the same concept. However, I would like to stress here that T3 is the active form of T4. However, T3 has a very, very small half-life. So T4 can survive more in the bloodstream. So thyroid gland releases T4 and T3, more T4 than T3. However, in the peripheral tissue, so for example, let's say they are destined for the heart. So in the heart, we're going to have enzymes that are going to convert T4 to T3. And T3 is the one that's going to exert the effect. Also, it is important to mention that T3 is hydrophobic. So it's going to have an intracellular receptor as its target. Here we can see calcitonin, and the parathyroid gland releases PTH, parathyroid hormone. And their goal is to regulate the calcium levels. The release of either calcitonin or parathyroid hormone is not under the control of the pituitary or the hypothalamus. They just act on their own by sensing if the calcium levels are too low. Then the parathyroid gland will release PTH, and in turn the calcium will rise. Or if the calcium gets too high, then the thyroid cells that release calcitonin, which again are not under the effect of TSH, will make sure that the calcium level falls. How can we control calcium levels? Well, three ways. The first one, let's say I want to increase my calcium levels. So we're at the lower, so the effect of the parathyroid gland. Let's say I want to increase my calcium levels. I have three techniques for doing that. One is if I have stored it anywhere, to release it, which is what happens in the first picture. We have increase of calcium from the bones where it is stored. Then is to take all the calcium I can from the food that I ate. So we have increased calcium uptake in the intestines. And the final one is to get rid of as less calcium as possible. So at the level of the kidneys, the calcium is reabsorbed. And we can see that these are different effects in different tissues caused by the same hormone. Why? Receptors. Different tissue, different receptor. What does that mean? That means that the part of the receptor that is responsible for recognizing PTH is the same, but the part of the receptor that was responsible for the intracellular signal transduction. So, for example, if you remembered, this is a cell, and this is a receptor, let's say for PTH, and this is gonna be my PTH. Excuse me for my awful drawing. Then we're going to have a signal transduction intracellularly through many steps that are going to cause effect A, because this was receptor A. Then in another cell, let's say this is the cell now I'm talking about, cell B, this was still A, I'm gonna have the same recognizing area for my PTH, but that is receptor B. So this time I'm gonna draw it like that. Different receptor, same area for recognition of the parathyroid hormone, different area for the intracellular signaling. So right now the pathway that is going to happen intracellularly, it's going to be a different one. So different effects from different tissues from the same hormone. The opposite effects take place from calcitonin. Excuse me. So calcitonin does the opposite effects since its goal is to lower the levels of calcium. Then we said that the adrenal medulla releases norepinephrine and epinephrine in the bloodstream, more epinephrine than norepinephrine, and its effect is the fight or flight response, the main effect of the sympathetic nervous system. Again, this will be dealt more detail in a session about the nervous system in general. So the effects of the sympathetic nervous system, let's summarize them more or less, is the fight or flight response. So it is the response that our bodies have when we are in danger, for example. And also epinephrine is called adrenaline. So we are all familiar of the effects of adrenaline. What is that? Peripheral vasoconstriction. Why? I don't want the blood to be in my skin. I need it to go to the vital organs. That's number one priority. Increase heart rate, increase blood pressure. So why increase heart rate? So the blood moves around more faster, oxygenates more faster because I'm running, for example. Right now I'm doing the flight part. So I'm running. So I need to constantly, the blood needs to move faster and more efficiently in order to oxygenate the muscles. Increase lipid breakdown. We need fuel for that. And also glycogen to be converted from glucose. So it has a hyperglycemic effect. So it increases the levels of glucose in our bloodstream. And again, the reason why is because we need some fuel. Another also effect that is not said here is that we have in the digestive system vasoconstriction. Like that, I don't, and also inhibition of peristalsis and digestion in general. Because when I'm running, my goal is not to digest right now. My goal is to escape danger. That is what the brain is thinking, at least. Imagine being on a fighting someone and suddenly your belly decided it's time to digest. I'm sorry, you cannot fight now. Well, that's not how it works. Then let's review the pancreas. Again, the pancreas is not under the control of the pituitary. And as we said in the beginning of this session, the pancreas has an exocrine and an endocrine function. And here we can see the endocrine function of the pancreas. The pancreas secretes two main hormones. One is glucagon and the other one is insulin. And in the pancreas, we have specific aggregations of cells called the islet of Langerhans, and they have different types of cells. More specifically, they have alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And the alpha cells in the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas are the ones that are going to secrete glucagon, and the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas are the ones that are going to secrete insulin. What is the effect? The pancreas releases insulin in response to high blood glucose. So insulin causes the fat cells to take glucose from the blood, and as a result, the blood levels of glucose are lowered. Normal. Glucagon response causes the pancreas to increase. Glucagon, which is released by the pancreas, causes an increase in the blood glucose, and it does that through the liver It acts at the level of the liver, and it says the liver, break down your glycogen right now and release your glucose into the blood. While insulin also tells the liver, take up some glucose and start building glycogen. Again, the effects of insulin and glucagon are very antagonistic, and the end goal of these effects is to either lower or increase blood glycemia, as it is called, which is the level of glucose in the blood. I would like to mention that we saw other hormones that are uh, having an effect in blood glycemia. So blood glycemia is not only controlled by insulin and by the pancreas, it is also controlled by cortisone. Sorry, we're gonna see in the next slide. By epinephrine and norepinephrine, as we saw before. And again, here it's another picture that shows you at which levels the glucagon or the insulin is released. So, for example, consider low, and we want to start releasing glucagon when it's less than 80, and more than 120 is when we want to start releasing insulin. So the level should not get higher than that. The level of glucose in the blood should not get higher than 120, for the very simple reason that insulin should do its job right. If insulin works and it works well, then there is no need to. Why is the blood of that person 130? Because the effects of those are rather fast. So my point is that it is pathologic to have increased glucose levels, because that means there is something wrong with the insulin release, or of course the glucagon release, but not so much. Then cortisol again, we talked about it briefly before. We can see that it has many effects on many tissues. And one of the things that I wanted you to notice is that it causes glycogenolysis, decreased glycogenosynthesis, and increased insulin resistance. So cortisol is pretty much fighting insulin. Insulin and cortisol want opposite things. And if you remember what I told you earlier, is that in the morning when you wake up, your cortisol levels are higher. Okay, and that makes sense, because while insulin wants to reduce your glucose level, cortisol wants to increase them. And when you wake up in the morning, you need energy, you need fuel. So cortisol is there taking care of you and stopping insulin from making you go back to bed, basically. Diabetes is a disease where, for some reason, the levels of glucose in the blood are not normal. And not just not normal, but increased. We have two types of diabetes mellitus, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 means that there is a problem at the level of the pancreas, at the level of the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans, and they don't secrete insulin. So what happens in that case? That the glucose is increased in the bloodstream. And then type 2 means that our cells do not respond to insulin. They develop insulin resistance. They can do that through multiple ways. For example, if we consider the concepts that we saw before, maybe these cells just have a receptive part. They no longer have the signal and intracellular signal transduction part. So when insulin binds to the receptor, nothing happens. So there is not an effect of insulin. As a result, at the end of the day, the cells do not absorb glucose. So there is increased glycemia in the blood. And that is a problem. And it is not the high glucose in the blood that is going to kill you. Because if you have very severe, uncontrolled diabetes, that is a very critical condition. You can go into a coma and eventually die from uncontrolled diabetes. But what kills you is not that there is too much glucose in your blood, it's that there is no glucose inside your cells. And that is important, an important concept to grasp. if the cells don't have glucose, they don't have fuels, and they start to die, they don't have energy. And that is what is dangerous in diabetes. Then let's talk about the pineal gland quite briefly. What I would like to mention about the pineal gland is that it secretes melatonin. And it secretes melatonin by converting serotonin to melatonin. Melatonin is responsible for sleeping, and it is secreted at night. So when you're exposed to darkness, you start secreting melatonin by the pineal gland, which, as we said, converts serotonin to N-acetyltransferase. Again, the pineal gland is not under the control of the hypothalamus and the pituitary, at least not directly. And we can see there is a very specific nervous pathway which starts from the eye, which detects light, and arrives all the way to the pineal gland. And this pathway is going to activate or inhibit that enzyme. As long as this pathway is running, so as long as there is light, this enzyme, N-acetyltransferase, is inhibited, so serotonin cannot be converted to melatonin. However, when this pathway no longer receives light, so when it is no longer activated, it stops inhibiting, so N-acetyltransferase is free to do its job and converts serotonin to melatonin. And that's how the day to night cycle is regulated. That's why we shouldn't be on our phones before we go to bed at night. Here we can see the circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythm is any biological pattern that is based on a cycle of approximately 24 hours. Again, it is an important concept to know. Many hormones follow a circadian pattern of their own. And we can see something. In the biological 9, melatonin goes up because of the concept that we described. And in the morning, cortisol rises. So we have a peak of cortisol in the morning. Of course, this is not the most accurate graph. I just want to mention the peak is right here. It's like that. And then it falls to some normal high levels. And then it drops even more at night. And then it goes like that. So if I wanted to, correct this diagram, cortisol would be more like that. Okay. It's not the most accurate. However, what is important is to understand that it follows a cycle. So the same thing that I will see in 24 hours, it will be repeated again. And we said that cortisol is higher in the morning. We have a peak in the morning. And the reason for that is so we can get up. And also, if you remember what I told you about cortisol, that it has also an inhibiting effect to our nervous system. That's why in the morning, when you are sick, you're feeling better. You don't have so much fever because your immune system is responsible for your fever. Whereas later in the day, your fever starts getting worse because cortisol gets down. I want to make a very important distinction that I mentioned earlier. I just want to stress it a bit more. The fact that we talked about the endocrine organs, this does not mean that these are the only organs with endocrine function. Endocrine organ means an organ whose primary purpose is an endocrine function. We have other organs, like the heart, for example. The heart is not an endocrine organ. Of course not. Its primary function is to pump blood, period. However, it has an endocrine function on it. It can secrete these natriuretic peptides, as you can see here, ANP and BNP. Atrial natriuretic peptide and brain natriuretic peptide, named like that because back in the day they thought it was they thought it was from the brain, but it is from the heart. Atrial is from the atria and the BNP is from the ventricles. And they are natriuretic peptides, so they have exactly the opposite action with ADH that we saw earlier. ADH was antidiuretic hormone, ANP is atrial natriuretic peptide function, completely opposite. ADH causes retention of water in our body, while ANP causes excretion of water, and water is excreted through sodium. When you do your renal physiology, visit this concept, how water follows sodium. So it causes sodium to be excreted, but water follows it, which is its ultimate goal. And also, in the digestive tract, we can see that many hormones are secreted at different levels. And of course, again, same concept applies as before. The main function of the gastrointestinal tract is not to secrete hormones. It's not an endocrine organ. However, it has an endocrine function. Main purpose is digestion, of course. I don't want you to know these hormones. If you think you should know them in more detail, you can watch this video where I took this table from this video here on YouTube. And this is the end of the endocrine system and my presentation about it. Feel free to email me. I will be trying to check my emails more often. And also hit the like button and also add the little bell thingy that gives you notifications when I upload, because I'm gonna start uploading more often. Good luck if you're preparing for the IMAT, and I'm here to help any way I can. Bye bye.